Welcome. I'm so incredibly glad you're joining us for this deep dive into the sources today because we are looking at what is honestly one of the most fascinating stacks of material we've ever had on the
It
desk.
really is. It's a wild mix.
Yeah, we've got this incredible combination of cutting-edge academic research, ancient Hebrew manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and rabbinic texts like the Mishnah.
It's a remarkable collection of texts to synthesize.
Hmm.
We're looking at the foundational work of scholars like Dr. Miles Jones and Dr. Nehemiah Gordon, alongside some very deep historical and linguistic records. And all of this material points to a very different understanding of some of the most famous historical events in the world.
Right, and here is our mission for today. If you have ever spent time reading the historical accounts of the crucifixion, you have almost certainly hit some major speed bumps.
Oh, absolutely.
For centuries, readers have struggled with what look like glaring contradictions in the timeline. I mean, the math just doesn't seem to add up. You read one gospel account, then you read another, and suddenly you feel like you need a whiteboard and a red string just to make sense of the chronology.
You really do.
So today, we're going on an investigative journey. We want to see how recovering the original Hebrew calendrical logic completely resolves these mysteries. We're going to look at how these sources provide a literal, mathematically perfect fulfillment of ancient prophecy that the traditional timelines simply cannot pull off. And to help us connect all these ancient dots, I am joined by our resident expert.
Thank you. And to set the stage for you as you listen, the main paradigm shift we really need to make today is stepping away from the Western Greek philosophical lens.
Which is hard for us to do.
It is. But when we look at these ancient texts through modern Western eyes, things get blurry. Discoveries by Dr. Gordon, Dr. Jones, and others, like unearthing Hebrew manuscripts in the Vatican Library or analyzing the ancient silver scrolls, they prove something crucial. These texts are a unified Hebrew revelation.
Right.
When we return to the original Hebrew context, the timeline contradictions don't just vanish. They reveal this breathtakingly precise engineering.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the most famous, glaring math problem in the traditional narrative. If you grew up hearing this story, or even just absorbing it through cultural osmosis, you know the standard timeline.
A Friday afternoon crucifixion followed by a Sunday morning resurrection.
Exactly. But in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, Yeshua gives what he calls the sign of Jonah. He specifically prophesies that he will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, a literal 72 hours.
Right.
I don't know about you, but I remember being a kid, counting on my fingers from Friday afternoon to Sunday morning, and feeling like I was failing basic math.
It just doesn't work out to 72 hours.
Right.
What's fascinating here is that the solution requires us to completely reorient how we track time itself. You are trying to do Western math on an Eastern calendar.
Yeah.
In our modern culture, days begin at midnight. But biblically, as established all the way back in the opening chapters of Genesis, the evening and the morning make the day. A biblical day begins at sundown.
Sundown, which changes everything.
It changes the entire calculation. To fulfill that literal 72-hour prophecy, the textual and historical evidence points not to a Friday, but to a Wednesday crucifixion.
A Wednesday crucifixion. Now, I know for someone listening right now that might sound totally out of left field.
Sure.
But the key to unlocking this Wednesday timeline is understanding that there wasn't just one Sabbath that week. There were 2.
This is the tale of 2 Sabbaths. In the traditional Western mind, a Sabbath is always Saturday. You work during the week, you rest on the weekend. But the biblical text outlines specific festival days that are treated as Sabbaths.
Right, the high days.
Exactly. They require complete rest, regardless of what day of the week they happen to fall on. Think of it a bit like Thanksgiving.
That's a great analogy.
Thanksgiving is always on a Thursday, but it operates like a Sunday. Most people are off work, businesses close, it's a day of rest and gathering. Then, 2 days later, you hit your actual weekend.
Yeah.
In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 31, the text explicitly tells us that the Sabbath, immediately following the crucifixion, was not a normal weekly Sabbath. It was a high day.
A high day, meaning it was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Nisan 15 on the Hebrew calendar.
It was a commanded day of total rest. If the crucifixion happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the sun goes down a few hours later and we immediately enter Thursday. But that Thursday is a high Sabbath. No work can be done.
Which completely solves what I like to call the spice paradox in the Gospels.
Yes.
If you read the accounts carefully, there is this notorious perceived contradiction about the women preparing spices for the burial. Mark chapter 16, verse 1 says, the women bought spices after the Sabbath was over. But Luke chapter 23, verse 56 says they prepared the spices and then rested on the Sabbath. I've heard people use this specific detail to claim the texts are historically unreliable. Walk us through how the Wednesday timeline fixes this.
It completely harmonizes the text once you slot the two Sabbaths into place.
Okay, let's map it out.
Wednesday afternoon, the crucifixion happens. Wednesday at sundown, the high Sabbath begins.
Yeah.
So all day Thursday, the women are resting for the high day. Thursday at sundown, the high Sabbath ends.
So the next day is Friday.
Right, Friday is a normal work day. It sits right between the two Sabbaths. So on Friday, they go out, they buy the spices, and they prepare them.
Fulfilling the book of Mark. They bought them after the high Sabbath was over.
Exactly. Then Friday at sundown, the normal weekly Saturday Sabbath begins. And they rest again, exactly as Luke described.
That is brilliant.
Mark is referring to them buying spices after the high Sabbath on Thursday. Luke is referring to them resting on the weekly Sabbath on Saturday.
It makes perfect sense when you see it on a timeline. But wait, let's verify the math for the 72 hours. If he is buried right before sundown on Wednesday, does that actually get us to Sunday morning?
Let's count it out. Wednesday sundown to Thursday sundown is exactly 1 day and 1 night.
Okay.
Thursday sundown to Friday sundown is day 2 and night 2. Friday sundown to Saturday sundown is day 3 and night 3. Exactly 72 hours. The resurrection happens right as Saturday is ending and Sunday is beginning at sundown.
So by the time the women arrive at the tomb early Sunday morning, while it is still dark...
The tomb is already empty. He had been gone for hours. The mathematics are flawless, completely vindicating the sign of Jonah.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Solving the 72-hour problem is incredibly satisfying, but it brings us to the next major chronological puzzle in the sources, the Last Supper paradox.
This is a big one.
If you are reading along in the sources, there is a massive debate among scholars about when this meal actually happened. The Gospel of John clearly states that the crucifixion happened at the exact same time the Passover lambs were being slain in the temple.
Right.
But the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, describe the Last Supper as a Passover meal. How can he eat the Passover meal if he is the Passover lamb being sacrificed at the same time? Are these two different traditions just crashing into each other?
Not at all. But this raises an important question about the cultural and regional divisions of the first century. Judea and Galilee had distinctly different customs, and they didn't always see eye to eye.
Different regions today.
Very much so. Our sources point us to the Mishnah, specifically Tractate Pesachim, chapter 4. This is a primary historical text detailing Galilean customs. According to the Mishnah, Galileans observed something called the Fast of the Firstborn. Because of this, they ceased all work on the 14th of Nisan. And because the biblical day begins at sundown, the Galileans would eat a formal, culturally recognized meal right at the start of Nisan 14. This was known as the Suda Mafseket, or the meal of cessation.
A meal of cessation?
Right. They ate this meal hours before the Judean temple sacrifices even began. Yeshua and his disciples were Galileans, so they were operating on this Galilean timeline.
Okay, I follow the regional difference. It's like how different cultures or even different time zones today might kick off a holiday on different schedules.
Precisely.
But is it just a regional difference? Because the sources mention the Dead Sea Scrolls and a scholar named Annie Joubert, which suggests there was a whole different calendar system operating in the background.
The regional difference is really just the surface layer. Underneath it is a massive calendrical dispute that had been raging for generations. Annie Joubert was a phenomenal scholar who did foundational research on the text from Qumran and the Book of Jubilees.
And what did she find?
What she, along with scholars like Florentino Garcia Martinez, uncovered is that the first century Jewish world was deeply divided over how to track time. The Sadducees, who were the wealthy political elite controlling the temple in Jerusalem, operated on a Greek-influenced lunisolar calendar.
Let's define that for the listener really quick. A lunisolar calendar means the dates shift around the days of the week from year to year, sort of like how your birthday falls on a Tuesday one year and a Wednesday the next.
Correct. The Sadducees had adopted this system largely to align with the political and economic realities of the broader Hellenistic world.
Makes sense.
But ancient, strictly observant groups, like the Essenes who lived out at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, viewed this lunisolar calendar as a severe corruption. They believed it was a violation of divine law.
So what did they use instead?
They followed a much older 364-day solar calendar They believe this was the original calendar given to Enoch and the patriarchs. And the mathematics of this 364-day solar calendar dictates something incredibly specific.
Which is
Passover always falls on a Tuesday evening, every single year.
always a Tuesday. Wow. So how does that intersect with the Galilean meal we just talked about?
They overlap perfectly. The Galileans, who were often at odds with the elite Sadducees in Jerusalem, were highly sympathetic to the older, more traditional ways of tracking time.
Right.
So when Yeshua and his disciples sit down for their Galilean Suda Mafseket, their meal of cessation, they are doing it on a Tuesday evening.
That is fascinating.
It provides a vital legal and religious framework. On the ancient solar calendar of the Essenes, Yeshua is legally and rightfully celebrating a Passover meal on Tuesday night with his disciples.
And then the trials happen.
Exactly. He's betrayed, arrested, and put through the trials. Days later, on Wednesday afternoon, he is crucified. This aligns perfectly with the Sadducean lunisolar timeline, which is when the temple priests are actively slaughtering the national Passover lambs.
Why does this matter to the listener today? I think sometimes when we get deep into the weeds of ancient calendars and political sects, it can feel purely academic.
Right, like dry history.
Yeah, but what you are saying is that this isn't just trivia. When you understand this historical context, you realize the text isn't making a mistake. Yeshua literally fulfills the ancient solar calendar of the patriarchs and the active temple calendar simultaneously. It builds immense confidence in the historical reliability of the text.
It shifts the entire narrative from a confusing historical puzzle to a masterclass in divine precision. He honors the ancient, untainted calendar of the patriarchs for his meal, and then he submits to the corrupt political calendar of the temple to become the sacrifice.
The precision doesn't stop there. That simultaneous fulfillment extends perfectly into the agricultural shadow established in the Torah. Which brings us to Leviticus 23 and the festival of Yom HaBikurim, or first fruits. Let's talk about the agricultural shadow because this paints such a vivid picture.
It's beautiful. Leviticus 23 commands the priest to wave a sheaf of the very first barley harvest on the day after the Sabbath.
The day after the weekly Saturday Sabbath is Sunday.
Right. And again, applying our rule that biblical days begin at evening, Sunday actually begins at sundown on Saturday night.
I want you to imagine this scene if you are listening. Picture first century Jerusalem. The exact moment the weekly Sabbath ends on Saturday night, the sun dips below the horizon. The temple priests walk out of the city gates, crossing the Kidron Valley in the moonlight, carrying their sickles.
It's a highly choreographed event.
They walk into a specific field to harvest the literal earthly barley, the very first fruits of the earth. Wait, are you saying that the physical harvesting of the barley and the resurrection were happening at the exact same hour?
Yes.
How can we be sure of that timing?
The timing is locked in by the very laws the priests were following. They couldn't harvest a minute before sundown because it would violate the Sabbath.
Right.
And they wouldn't wait until the next morning because the ceremony required the freshest cut at the earliest permissible moment of the new day. So at that exact mathematical moment, they swing the sickle to harvest the earthly first fruits. Yeshua conquers death. Wow. 1 Corinthians 15 calls him the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. By rising from the earth at that precise moment, he flawlessly executes the agricultural shadow. He becomes the physical guarantee that the rest of the harvest, the resurrection of believers, will eventually follow.
But the biblical timeline doesn't stop at the resurrection, does it? That Saturday night harvest actually triggers a massive divine countdown.
It does. Leviticus 23 commands a strict 50-day countdown starting from the waving of the first fruits. You count 7 full Sabbaths, 50 days, which lands on the festival of Shavuot, or as it's known in Greek, Pentecost.
This 50-day countdown links the agricultural harvest to the spiritual harvest in the most profound way. Historically, in the book of Exodus, this exact 50-day timeline aligns with the Israelites arriving at Mount Sinai.
Yes, exactly 50 days later.
But there's a massive contrast between what happens at Mount Sinai in the Old Testament and what happens in Jerusalem in the New Testament. Walk us through that math.
The first Shavuot was the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. God descends in fire. But there is tragedy there. Because the people rebelled by building the golden calf, the text in Exodus tells us that exactly 3,000 men died that day under the strict letter of the law.
3,000 died.
Right. Now, jump forward a millennium and a half to the book of Acts, chapter 2. It's the day of Shavuot, Pentecost. The disciples are gathered in Jerusalem in faithful obedience to the continuous eternal framework of the feasts.
Because remember, prophecies in Zechariah 14 show these feasts were never abolished. They are part of an eternal cycle.
Precisely. They are gathered in Zion for Shavuot, and fire descends again. But this time, it is the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. Rather than the law being written on tablets of stone, it is being written on their hearts.
And what's the result of that?
The ultimate result. The text explicitly tells us that exactly 3,000 souls were saved. 3,000 died in Sinai, 3,000 saved at Zion. It is a mathematically perfect divine reversal.
So what does this all mean? To synthesize what we've unpacked today for you, we started with a math problem that has bothered readers for hundreds of years. How do you get 72 hours out of a Friday to Sunday timeline?
The answer is, you can't.
Right. But when you look at these texts through their original Hebrew, calendrical, and agricultural contexts, the picture becomes incredibly clear.
It all comes into focus.
When you recognize the high-day Sabbath, the Galilean traditions, the Dead Sea Scrolls solar calendar, and the exact down-to-the-minute timing of the barley harvest, what looks like a contradiction to the modern eye is actually a brilliantly engineered, perfectly timed eternal framework.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is why recovering the Hebrew roots of these texts is so vital. Scholars like Dr. Miles Jones highlight the Hebrew puns and transliterated words in the Greek text, proving these writings were conceived in a completely Hebrew mindset. When we read it that way, we see that this meticulous timing proves these texts are a unified Hebrew revelation. They're intricately preserved down to the exact hours, days, and even the head counts of the people involved. It shows that the author of the text is sovereign over time itself.
It really does completely reshape how you read these accounts. As we wrap up this deep dive into the sources, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to ponder on your own.
There's always one more layer.
Always. It's a detail from the Leviticus 23 text that we didn't fully expand on, but it is deeply profound. During that Shavuot offering, 50 days after the resurrection, Leviticus commands the priests to bring a new grain offering.
Right.
But unlike the Passover bread, which is strictly unleavened, Leviticus 23.17 commands that the 2 loaves of bread for Shavuot must be baked with leaven.
With leaven. Now, biblically, leaven represents human nature, the capacity for sin. The first fruits, Yeshua, was unleavened and sinless. But the harvest of Shavuot, the Pentecost harvest, represents the believers. It represents humanity, filled with the Spirit, yes, but still possessing human nature, still carrying that leaven until the final redemption.
That is a beautiful connection.
So I want you to think about this as you go about your day. How does realizing that you are represented by those purposely leavened loaves change the way you view your own imperfections within this perfect, mathematically precise, eternal plan?
That's a great question to end on.
It's been an incredible journey through these sources today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We look forward to exploring more fascinating texts with you next time. Take care.